of their game. I want to bring in Jack Posobiec. At the same time, we're going to have Matt Rosendale. Try and get Matt Rosendale on the show to join us. We're going to get to the Chinese spy balloon in a minute. But, Jack, you know the region. Number one, you're pretty unique in that you speak perfect Mandarin. You're a naval intelligence officer. You've been stationed in Beijing. You've been stationed in mainland China. You're one of the smartest guys on strategy I know in military intelligence. And you also, given your Polish heritage and background and roots, and your wife's from Belarus, you know this region, the bloodlands, as well as anybody. I just want your assessment of the loose talk you saw there on Morning Joe, and that's getting to be the mantra now over at the mainstream media, that Putin must be. It's the vital national security interest of the United States of America that's being invaded on its southern border and has an existential threat in the South China Sea and Taiwan, that it is in the vital national security interest of the United States of America and the American citizens to defeat Putin and the Russian army on the battlefield in Ukraine. Jack Posobiec, your assessment of that, sir.
Yeah, Steve, I think Gary Kasparov should go back to the chessboard. I mean, he's known for being great at playing games that I play with my children, and that's great. Good for him. I appreciate it. But this idea that he should nonchalantly talk about regime change in Russia, it's dangerous. This is dangerous, loose, glib talk. It's very glib. And, I mean, just go down the list, Stephen. You've talked about Carolus Rex just there. We've talked about others who have attempted this. By the way, we have gone through one regime change in Russia in recent history, or at least recent modern history, in 1917, when we said, well, if we can just get rid of that czar, then Russia's going to be completely fine. Look what happened. Look how that turned out for the world. Look how that turned out for the region when you unleashed the Bolsheviks, when the German Kaiser sent Lenin back on his train car back to Berlin, and we unleashed that insanity on the entire world and had to deal with it for the next 70, 80 years of the Soviet menace. Now they're talking about nonchalantly getting rid of Putin. Who knows who's going to come to power if we get rid of Putin? And they know, by the way, that we're the ones behind it. Meanwhile, you hear the same glib talk like Peter Zahan when he was on Joe Rogan recently saying, well, we need to push him in the corner. We need to push him in the corner. We need to push him in the corner and defeat him on the battlefield. Then they admit, and I got to give Scarborough credit here for at least asking the question. He said, well, if you push him in the corner, wouldn't he use nuclear weapons? Because this is the danger of using World War II formulations on nuclear-powered states. In 1945, Imperial Japan didn't have the bomb. That's why Truman and the United States were able to use atomic weapons and pound them with impunity, because they can't respond. The same way that Ukraine doesn't have nuclear weapons today. But guess what? Russia does. And as a matter of fact, they have more nuclear weapons and more missiles than we do. They have 6,000 nuclear-tipped missiles. And guess what? Are you going to take out all of them? How much is it worth to you, Gary? What city is it worth to you? Are you worth giving up our nuclear arsenal in Montana where that balloon's floating over? Is it worth giving up Seattle, Washington, New York City? You know New York would be one of the first targets. Washington would be next, where my children live. So no, Gary, I don't think it's worth it to me to risk losing an American city just because you want to be able to get points on MSNBC. Absolutely not.
But I want to stick on this. I got to go back. When you talk about, and you use the example of the American Civil War and World War II, about unconditional surrender, the probability to defeat Putin's army to defeat him on the battlefield with unconditional surrender. And American people understand that that's the types of talk you're hearing in Washington, D.C. with all this money going over there. From your intelligence, put your intelligence hat on for a second, and your ability to assess order of battle and resources. Given the Ukrainian army as it stands today, sir, even with some support, logistic support, and new weapons from the Americans,
go watch.
What's the probability we could defeat Putin on the battlefield in Ukraine unconditionally, destroy his army unconditionally, destroy the Russian people unconditionally on the battlefield in Ukraine, sir? By the way,
I'd love to ask Gary, what's all this we talk? What's all this we talk, Gary? You and I are sitting in studios. We're not out there on the battlefield. We're not out there in the trenches. It's not our families in Bakhmut and Avdiivka and Soledar that are being crushed right now in the Donbass region. It's not us. We're sitting in palatial studios all over the world. These are the families that are actually being crushed, not you, not your family, not our children. And I hope to God that my children aren't involved in this. Go watch Zelensky's interview with my former colleague Trey Yingst that he did this week in Kiev, where Zelensky himself admits it. He says, look, you've sent us over a dozen tanks, a couple dozen tanks. Thanks, we appreciate it. But Russia has 1,200 tanks. Russia has thousands of tanks and fighters that they are able to send into this fight. So you're going to send over a couple of tanks when we don't even have the training, we don't have the maintenance, we don't have the logistics, the supply chains. By the way, you've got to get them all the way from the border in Lviv all the way to the front, which is in Donbass. That's the other side of Ukraine. And I don't know if you're aware, but Ukraine's kind of a big country that, oh, by the way, is in the midst of warfare right now. So you've got to make sure that Russia doesn't decide to blow those things out of the sky with a Caliber cruise missile, or blow them out of the ground, I should say, as they're making their way across to the battlefront. This idea that a couple of tanks are going to be enough to take the Russians all the way to unconditional surrender, it's ridiculous. First of all, the Russians don't do unconditional surrender. These are the people who burned down their own capital just so that Napoleon wouldn't have a place to be able to spend the winter. Then they took the whole army, they went into the forest, they waited him out. Then when Napoleon finally quit, they came back in. They don't do unconditional surrender, Gary. I don't know if you've been paying attention to, I don't know, a little thing called all of Russian history. They just don't do it. And so when you're dealing with them, you have to understand from a higher strategic standpoint, they're always, and Macron even made this point, that at the end of the day, whatever this stands out, they're going to be there at the other end of Europe. You're going to have to deal with them. So these silly, fanciful, cartoony kind of fairy tales that Gary Kasparov and MSNBC want to spread are ridiculous. They're not tied in any way. They're completely divorced from reality. And the reality is that you will have a regime in the Kremlin one way or the other. And it's not going to necessarily be this fancy one that's perfect one that you wish it was. It's going to be a Russian one. So you have to start from there and then decide, where do you go with this? At the end of the day, and I've said this before, that region, that Volgograd Gap, it is not in America's existential strategic interests to maintain control of that for the globalist American empire. But they understand, the same way that the Kaiser understood it, the same way that Hitler understood it at Stalingrad, that if you take the Volgograd Gap, if you take that area, which is between the Black Sea and the Caspian, which connects the two rivers, the two seas, and then the Volga, which goes all the way up to Moscow. That is the key to the Russian heartland. Any Russian leader, I don't care who it is, will fight to the death to defend that land.
Before you go to break, and you're going to stick with us for a while, but before we go to the break, the ability to take back the Donbass, which has been this territory in dispute that Russia now controls and has controlled for a while, but now controls militarily in the Crimea. What's the probability that could be taken back?
Zero.
Zero. Okay. Zero. No doubt in your mind.
I mean, you would have to go to nuclear war to even broach the concept. Russia will never. The Sevastopol is their. This is their Russian. This is the Black Sea Fleet, the home port of the Black Sea Fleet. They will never give up Crimea. You saw what they did to maintain Stalingrad. Do we really want to open that up again? Really?
Okay. Short commercial break. Jack Posobiec, a naval intelligence officer, speaks perfect Mandarin.